I was 17 when my stepfather broke 3 of my ribs. My family told everyone I fell down the stairs. But when Dr. Martina saw my x-rays, she didn't believe their story for a second. What happened next changed everything and exposed secrets my family had been hiding for years. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. My name is Brooklyn Hayes, and I grew up in Millbrook, Ohio, one of those small towns where everyone knows everyone else's business, except when they choose to look the other way. My story begins 3 years after my mother, Sarah, married my stepfather, Marcus Kellerman. Marcus was everything my biological father wasn't. Where my dad had been unreliable and absent, Marcus was present and involved. Where my dad had struggled with addiction, Marcus was clean and successful. He owned a small construction company and coached Little League baseball on weekends. To the outside world, he was the perfect stepfather who had rescued a broken family. My mother met Marcus at her job at the county courthouse, where she worked as a filing clerk. She'd been raising me alone since my father left when I was 12, and Marcus represented stability, something we'd never had. He moved into our small ranch house on Cedar Street within 6 months of them meeting, bringing his tools, his pickup truck, and what seemed like endless patience for a teenage girl who wasn't entirely thrilled about sharing her mother's attention. At first, things were genuinely good. Marcus helped me with my math homework, taught me how to change a tire, and never missed one of my volleyball games at Millbrook High. He had this way of making my mother laugh that I hadn't seen since before my father's drinking got bad. For the first time in years, our house felt like a home instead of just a place where we happened to sleep. But somewhere during my junior year, things started to shift. It was subtle at first, little comments about my grades, my friends, the way I dressed. Marcus would make jokes about how I was just like my father whenever I did something that annoyed him. My mother would laugh nervously and tell him to stop, but she never really defended me. She was too grateful for the stability he provided, too afraid of being alone again. The first time Marcus grabbed me too hard was in January of my senior year. I'd come home 20 minutes past my curfew from a basketball game where our team had gone to overtime. My mother was already asleep, and Marcus was waiting in the living room, still in his work clothes, a beer in his hand. When I tried to explain about the game running late, he grabbed my arm and squeezed until I could feel his fingers digging into the bone. "Don't lie to me, Brooklyn," he said, his voice low and controlled. I drove past the school at 10:30. The parking lot was empty. I tried to pull away, but his grip tightened. I went to McDonald's with some of the team afterward. I texted Mom. "Your mother was asleep. She didn't get your text." His eyes had this cold look I'd never seen before. "You think you can just do whatever you want because you're almost 18? This is my house, Brooklyn. My rules." When he finally let go, there were bruises on my arm in the shape of his fingers. I wore long sleeves for a week, telling myself it was just stress from work, that he didn't mean to grip so hard. My mother never asked about the bruises, even though I caught her looking at them when I reached for something at dinner one night. The incidents became more frequent after that. A shove when I didn't clean the kitchen fast enough. A slap when I talked back by asking if I could go to a friend's house. Each time, Marcus would apologize afterward, explaining that work stress was getting to him, that he just wanted what was best for me. He'd buy me small gifts, a new phone case, my favorite candy, a gift card to the mall, and promise it wouldn't happen again. My mother saw the bruises. She had to have seen them. But every time I tried to bring up Marcus's behavior, she'd get this panicked look in her eyes and change the subject. She'd ask about my college applications or mention how hard Marcus was working to provide for us. Once, when I showed her a particularly bad bruise on my shoulder, she actually said, "You know how clumsy you can be, honey. Maybe you should be more careful." The isolation was almost worse than the physical abuse. Marcus had a way of making me doubt my own memory, my own experiences. He'd deny things that had happened just days before, or claim I was exaggerating, that I was dramatic, just like your father. He monitored my phone, checked my grades obsessively, and gradually discouraged me from spending time with friends. Ashley's not a good influence, he'd say about my best friend since middle school. Her parents are divorced. You don't need that kind of negativity in your life. When I protested, he'd get that cold look again. I'm trying to protect you, Brooklyn, but if you'd rather run around with girls who don't respect themselves or their families, maybe you need to learn some hard lessons about consequences. My grades started slipping. I quit the volleyball team because Marcus said I was staying at practice too late, that it was interfering with my responsibilities at home. I stopped hanging out with friends because it was easier than dealing with Marcus's questions and accusations afterward. The girl who had once been outgoing and confident became quiet and withdrawn. The worst part was how normal our family looked from the outside. Marcus never lost his temper in public. He was still the helpful neighbor who plowed driveways after snowstorms, the reliable contractor who showed up on time and did quality work. At school events, he and my mother looked like any other happy couple. Teachers would comment on how lucky I was to have such a supportive stepfather. "Your stepfather seems really invested in your education," my English teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, said one day when Marcus had emailed her about my progress on a project. "Not all parents are that involved." I wanted to tell her that his investment involved checking my backpack every night, reading my journals, and threatening to take away my car if my grades didn't improve. But how do you explain that kind of control to someone who only sees the surface? The breaking point came on a Thursday in March. I was supposed to be at the library working on my senior project, but I'd actually gone to Ashley's house to help her prepare for her parents' divorce mediation. She was devastated and needed someone to talk to. I knew Marcus wouldn't understand. He'd see it as disobedience, as putting someone else's problems before my family responsibilities. I tried to sneak in through the back door, hoping to avoid confrontation. But Marcus was waiting in the kitchen, my phone in his hand. He'd been tracking my location through the family plan. "Where were you?" His voice was deadly calm, which somehow scared me more than if he'd been yelling. "I was at the library." "Don't." He held up my phone, showing the GPS history. "You were at Ashley's house for 3 hours." My heart was pounding, but I tried to stand my ground. Her parents are getting divorced. She needed someone to talk to. "So you lied to me. You looked me in the eye this morning and lied." "I knew you wouldn't understand." "I understand perfectly." He set the phone down on the counter with deliberate precision. "I understand that you think the rules don't apply to you. I understand that you have no respect for this family or the sacrifices your mother and I have made for you." I could see my mother hovering in the doorway to the living room, her face pale and frightened. She opened her mouth like she might say something, then closed it again. "Marcus, please," I started, but he cut me off. "You want to act like an adult? Let me treat you like one." He stepped closer, and I could smell the beer on his breath. "In the real world, Brooklyn, actions have consequences. Maybe your father never taught you that, but I will." What happened next felt like it was happening in slow motion. Marcus grabbed my shoulders and shook me hard. When I tried to pull away, he pushed me backward. I stumbled, trying to catch my balance, but he grabbed me again and shoved me toward the kitchen island. The corner of the granite countertop caught me right in the ribs. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, a sharp, burning sensation that stole my breath. I doubled over, gasping, and Marcus grabbed me again, this time by the back of my shirt. "Maybe next time you'll think twice before lying to me," he hissed, and pushed me again. I fell hard onto the kitchen floor, my ribs screaming in protest. The pain was unlike anything I'd ever experienced, worse than any sports injury, worse than when I'd broken my wrist falling off my bike as a kid. Every breath felt like someone was stabbing me with a knife. Through the haze of pain, I could hear my mother crying, "Marcus, stop, she's hurt." But when I looked up at him, his face showed no remorse, no concern, just cold satisfaction. "She'll be fine," he said, stepping over me to get another beer from the refrigerator. Maybe now she'll learn to follow the rules. I managed to crawl to my room, each movement sending fresh waves of agony through my chest. I called Ashley, whispering into the phone about what had happened, but even talking hurt. She wanted to come over or call the police, but I begged her not to. I was terrified of making things worse. That night, I barely slept. The pain made it impossible to find a comfortable position, and every time I started to drift off, I'd accidentally roll over and wake up gasping. By morning, I could see the bruises forming along my left side, dark purple marks that looked like someone had taken a baseball bat to my ribs. My mother found me in the bathroom, trying to wrap an ace bandage around my torso. She took one look at the bruises and burst into tears. "Oh, honey," she whispered, reaching out to touch my face. "I'm so sorry. I should have. I didn't know he would." But even as she apologized, I could see the fear in her eyes. She was as trapped as I was, too scared to leave, too dependent on Marcus to risk confronting him. When I asked if she would help me get medical attention, she hesitated. "Maybe we should wait and see if it gets better on its own," she said. "You know how expensive doctor visits are, and Marcus is already stressed about money." For 2 days, I tried to tough it out. I went to school, moving carefully, avoiding any activity that might jar my ribs. I told friends I'd pulled a muscle working out. But the pain wasn't getting better. If anything, it was getting worse. I couldn't take deep breaths without feeling like my chest was on fire, and I'd started coughing up small amounts of blood. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. It was Ashley who finally convinced me to see the school nurse. Mrs. Patterson took one look at me and immediately called my mother, insisting that I needed medical attention. When my mother arrived at school, she looked terrified, but agreed to take me to the urgent care clinic across town, somewhere Marcus wouldn't think to look for us. The intake nurse asked routine questions about my injury. My mother jumped in before I could answer. "She fell down the stairs at home," she said, not meeting my eyes. "You know how clumsy teenagers can be. She tripped over the cat and tumbled right down." I stared at her, shocked by how easily the lie came. We didn't even have a cat. But when Dr. Elena Martinez came in to examine me, I could tell she wasn't buying the story. She was a small woman with kind eyes and gentle hands, probably in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She asked my mother to wait in the hallway while she examined me, claiming it was standard procedure for patients over 16. "Can you show me exactly where it hurts?" she asked, helping me lift my shirt to reveal the bruises. Dr. Martinez was quiet for a long time, studying the pattern of marks on my ribs. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentle but serious. "Brooklyn, these bruises, they don't look like they came from a fall down the stairs. Can you tell me what really happened?" For a moment, I considered sticking to the story. It would be easier, safer. But something about Dr. Martinez's expression, not judgmental, just concerned, made me want to tell the truth. "My stepfather pushed me," I whispered. "I hit the kitchen counter." Dr. Martinez nodded, as if she'd suspected as much. "How long has this been going on?" The question broke something open in me. All the months of isolation, fear, and gaslighting came pouring out. I told her about the escalating violence, about my mother's denial, about feeling trapped in my own home. Dr. Martinez listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or asking clarifying questions. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that changed everything. "Brooklyn, I'm going to need to order some x-rays to check for fractures, and I'm legally required to report suspected child abuse to Child Protective Services. Do you understand what that means?" The x-rays confirmed what Dr. Martinez suspected: 3 fractured ribs on my left side. She showed me the white lines on the dark films, pointing to each break with her pen. 2 of the fractures were clean, but the third showed signs of what she called displacement, where the bone had shifted out of position. "These injuries are consistent with blunt force trauma," Dr. Martinez explained, her voice professional but warm. The pattern suggests you were pushed against something with significant force, exactly what you described. While we waited for the CPS caseworker to arrive, Dr. Martinez prescribed pain medication and taught me breathing exercises to prevent pneumonia. She emphasized that I needed to avoid any physical activity for at least 6 weeks and warned me about symptoms that would require emergency care. If you have trouble breathing, severe pain that gets worse, or if you start coughing up more blood, you need to come to the hospital immediately, she said. Rib fractures can be serious if they're not properly monitored. My mother was pacing in the hallway when I emerged from the examination room. Her face was red and blotchy from crying, and she grabbed my arm the moment she saw me. "What did you tell her?" she whispered urgently. "Brooklyn, what did you say?" Before I could answer, Dr. Martinez appeared behind us. "Mrs. Kellerman, I need to speak with you privately about Brooklyn's injuries and our next steps." The conversation that followed was muffled but intense. Through the thin walls, I could hear my mother's voice rising and falling, sometimes pleading, sometimes defensive. Dr. Martinez remained calm and steady, occasionally asking pointed questions. At one point, I heard my mother say, "You don't understand. Marcus isn't a bad person. He's just been under a lot of pressure." When they emerged 20 minutes later, my mother's face was ashen. Dr. Martinez handed her a packet of information and a business card. "The CPS investigator will contact you within 24 hours to schedule an initial interview. Until then, Brooklyn should not be left alone with Mr. Kellerman. Do you have somewhere safe where she can stay?" My mother nodded mechanically. "My sister lives in Columbus. Yes, she could stay there for a few days." But I could see the panic in her eyes. She was already calculating how to explain this to Marcus, how to minimize the damage to their marriage. Even with my ribs broken and CPS involved, she was still trying to protect him. The drive to Aunt Linda's house in Columbus was silent except for the sound of my mother crying. Every bump in the road sent sharp pains through my chest, but I gritted my teeth and didn't complain. I knew she was already overwhelmed. "He's going to be so angry," she finally said as we pulled into Linda's driveway. "Brooklyn, he's going to think I planned this somehow, that I told you to go to the doctor." "Mom, he broke my ribs, 3 of them. The doctor said I could have punctured a lung." She turned to look at me, her eyes desperate. "But you know he didn't mean to hurt you that badly. Marcus isn't violent, honey. He has a temper sometimes. His father was the same way." I stared at her, amazed by her ability to rationalize what had happened. "So that makes it okay?" "No, of course not. But maybe if you hadn't lied to him—" "Don't," I cut her off, anger flaring despite the pain in my chest. "Don't you dare blame me for this." Aunt Linda took one look at my face and immediately ushered me inside, shooting my mother a look that could have frozen fire. Linda was my mother's older sister, divorced for 10 years, and she had never liked Marcus. She'd always said there was something off about him, though she'd kept her opinions mostly to herself for the sake of family peace. "What happened to you?" she demanded, helping me settle onto her couch with careful movements. My mother started to repeat the stairs story, but Linda held up a hand to stop her. "Don't, Sarah. Just don't. Look at her. Look at those bruises. That didn't come from falling downstairs." Over the next hour, the whole story came out. Linda listened with growing horror and anger, occasionally asking questions or making sharp comments about Marcus's behavior. Unlike my mother, she didn't make excuses or try to rationalize what had happened. "That man is dangerous," she said bluntly, "and you, Sarah, have been enabling him by pretending this isn't happening." My mother broke down completely at that point, sobbing into her hands. "I was so scared of being alone again. After David left, I thought I'd never find anyone else. Marcus made me feel safe, secure. I thought if I could just keep things stable, if I could make him happy." "By sacrificing your daughter?" Linda's voice was ice cold. "By letting him terrorize a child?" The CPS investigator, Janet Morrison, arrived the next afternoon. She was a tired-looking woman in her 40s with short gray hair and kind but watchful eyes. She interviewed me first, asking detailed questions about the incident and the pattern of abuse leading up to it. I told her everything: the escalating violence, my mother's denial, the way Marcus had isolated me from friends and activities. Janet took careful notes and asked follow-up questions that showed she understood the dynamics of domestic abuse. "Has he ever threatened to hurt you more seriously?" she asked. "Not in so many words, but he has this way of looking at me when he's angry, like he wants to hurt me worse, but he's holding back." Janet nodded. "And your mother? Has she ever tried to intervene or protect you?" That was the hardest question to answer honestly. She sees the bruises, she knows what's happening, but she always finds ways to explain it away or blame me for provoking him. When Janet interviewed my mother, I could hear raised voices from the kitchen where they were talking. My mother was defensive at first, insisting that Marcus was a good man who was just stressed about work and finances. But Janet was experienced in dealing with denial and gradually broke through her defenses. "Mrs. Kellerman, your daughter has 3 broken ribs. The medical evidence is clear that she was assaulted. If you continue to deny this reality, I'll have no choice but to recommend removing Brooklyn from the home permanently." That got my mother's attention. The idea of losing me completely was apparently more frightening than confronting Marcus. By the end of the interview, Janet had laid out the requirements. Marcus would be ordered to attend anger management counseling, the family would participate in supervised therapy sessions, and I would remain with my aunt until CPS was satisfied that it was safe for me to return home. If Marcus refused to comply, or if there were any further incidents, criminal charges would be filed. "What about school?" I asked. "I'm supposed to graduate in 3 months." "You can finish the school year from Columbus. I'll work with both school districts to arrange the transfer of your credits. Your safety is the priority right now." That evening, Marcus called Linda's house. She answered the phone, and I could hear his voice through the receiver, loud, angry, demanding to speak to me. Linda's responses were short and firm. "No, she's not available to talk to you because she has 3 broken ribs, Marcus. I don't care what your version of the story is. No, absolutely not. She's staying here until CPS says it's safe." When she hung up, Linda looked grim. "He's denying everything, claims you fell down the stairs and that your mother is lying to protect you from getting in trouble for something. He wants to know why no one called him from the hospital." "Because Dr. Martinez knew he was the one who hurt me," I said. "Smart doctor. Marcus also said he's hired a lawyer. He's planning to fight the CPS allegations." Over the next few days, I learned what it felt like to live without fear. Linda's house was peaceful. No walking on eggshells, no monitoring my every move, no sudden explosions of anger. I could breathe, as much as my ribs allowed, for the first time in months. Linda helped me enroll at Columbus East High School to finish my senior year. The transition was awkward, starting at a new school 3 months before graduation, but my grades were good enough that I was on track to graduate with my class. My teachers were understanding about my situation, especially when they saw how carefully I moved and the visible bruises on my arms. Ashley drove up from Millbrook twice that first week, bringing homework from my old school and updates about what was happening at home. The news wasn't good. "Your stepdad is telling everyone you're lying for attention," she reported. "He's saying your mom made up the abuse story because she's having some kind of breakdown. Some people are actually believing him." That hurt more than I'd expected. Marcus had always been good at managing his public image, and apparently he was using those skills to discredit me and my mother. "What about Mom?" I asked. Ashley's expression grew worried. "She looks terrible, Brooklyn, like she hasn't slept in days, and she's lost weight. Mrs. Henderson from next door said she heard them fighting every night this week." I felt guilty for leaving my mother alone to deal with Marcus's rage, but I also knew there was nothing I could have done to protect her. If anything, my presence would have made things worse. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following week. Janet Morrison explained that this would determine whether the temporary safety plan would continue or if more drastic measures were needed. Your stepdad's lawyer is arguing that this is all a misunderstanding, she told me during one of our regular check-ins. They're claiming you have a history of lying and attention-seeking behavior. They want the court to order you back home immediately. My stomach dropped. What if they believe him? They won't, Janet said firmly. The medical evidence is too clear. Dr. Martinez will testify about your injuries, and I have statements from your school counselor about the changes in your behavior over the past year. Your stepdad may be convincing, but facts don't lie. Still, as the hearing approached, I found myself terrified of being forced to return to that house. In my nightmares, Marcus would be waiting for me with that cold look in his eyes, angrier than ever about the trouble I'd caused. But I was also scared about what would happen to my mother if I didn't go back. Who would protect her from Marcus's anger? Who would be there to witness what he did to her when no one was looking? The night before the hearing, Linda found me crying on her back porch, wrapped in a blanket despite the warm spring evening. I'm scared, I admitted. What if the judge makes me go back? Linda sat down beside me and put her arm around my shoulders, careful not to jostle my still healing ribs. Then we'll figure out another plan. But Brooklyn, you can't go back to that house. Not while he's still there. I won't let that happen. What about Mom? Your mother is an adult. She can make her own choices about her marriage. But you're still a minor, and you deserve to be safe. As I sat there in the darkness, I realized that for the first time in months, someone was putting my safety and well-being first. It was a strange feeling, both relief and sadness mixed together. Relief that I wasn't alone anymore, and sadness that it had taken broken ribs for anyone to take my situation seriously. Tomorrow would determine whether I'd have to face Marcus again, or if I could finally start building a life free from his violence. Either way, I knew there was no going back to the way things were. The truth was finally out, and everything was about to change. The Franklin County Family Court building was imposing, all concrete and glass, with security guards at every entrance. Linda held my hand as we walked through the metal detectors, and I could feel my palms sweating despite the morning chill. Marcus was already there with his attorney, a sharp-dressed man named Robert Finch, who looked like he'd stepped out of a corporate law firm. Marcus wore his best suit, the navy one he'd worn to their wedding, and had gotten a fresh haircut. He looked every inch the respectable businessman, nothing like the man who had shoved me into a granite countertop. When our eyes met across the waiting area, his expression was unreadable. Not angry, not apologetic, just blank, as if I were a stranger. It was somehow more unsettling than if he'd glared at me. My mother sat beside him, looking fragile and hollow-eyed. She'd lost at least 15 pounds since I'd left home, and her clothes hung loose on her frame. When she saw me, tears started streaming down her face, but she didn't get up or acknowledge me beyond that silent crying. Judge Patricia Hernandez was a stern-looking woman in her 60s with silver hair and sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She reviewed the case file before calling the hearing to order, her expression giving nothing away about her thoughts on the situation. This is a preliminary hearing to determine the appropriate safety measures for the minor child Brooklyn Hayes, she announced. I'll hear testimony from the relevant parties and review the evidence before making a determination. Dr. Martinez testified first, explaining my injuries in clinical detail. She presented the X-rays on a screen, pointing out each fracture and explaining how the pattern of breaks indicated deliberate force rather than an accidental fall. In my professional opinion, she said, these injuries are consistent with the patient being pushed with significant force against a hard surface. The displacement of the third rib suggests the impact was severe enough to potentially cause life-threatening complications. Marcus's attorney cross-examined her, trying to suggest that the injuries could have resulted from a fall downstairs. Dr. Martinez remained calm and professional, methodically explaining why the medical evidence didn't support that scenario. The bruising pattern is wrong for a fall, she said. In a tumbling fall downstairs, you'd expect to see multiple impact points, scrapes, bruising on different parts of the body. Brooklyn's injuries are concentrated in one specific area, consistent with a single, forceful impact. Janet Morrison testified next, describing her investigation and the statements she'd collected. She read excerpts from interviews with school personnel who had noticed changes in my behavior, friends who had witnessed Marcus's controlling behavior, and neighbors who had heard shouting from our house on multiple occasions. The pattern of escalating control and violence is textbook domestic abuse, she stated. The minor child exhibited classic signs of an abuse victim: social isolation, declining grades, visible injuries that were explained away, fear of disappointing the perpetrator. When Marcus took the stand, his entire demeanor changed. Gone was the cold, controlling man I knew. Instead, he presented himself as a concerned stepfather who was heartbroken by false accusations. "I love Brooklyn like she was my own daughter," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I've tried so hard to be a good father figure to her, especially since her biological father abandoned the family. Sarah and I have provided her with stability, support, and love." His attorney guided him through his version of events: that I had a history of lying and attention-seeking behavior, that I resented his discipline and authority, that I had deliberately fallen down the stairs to frame him for abuse. "Brooklyn has always been rebellious," Marcus testified. "She lies about where she's going, breaks curfew, hangs around with troubled kids. When I try to set boundaries, she acts like I'm the villain. I think she saw an opportunity to get rid of me and took it." Listening to him twist everything into my fault was nauseating. He made himself sound like the victim, the devoted stepfather falsely accused by an ungrateful teenager. His performance was so convincing that I found myself wondering if some people in the courtroom were buying it. But then my mother took the stand, and everything changed. Sarah Kellerman looked tiny in the witness chair, dwarfed by the formal courtroom setting. Marcus's attorney began questioning her, clearly expecting her to support her husband's version of events. But something had shifted in my mother during the week since my injury. "Mrs. Kellerman, did you witness the incident on March 15th?" the lawyer asked. My mother was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands. When she finally looked up, her eyes found mine across the courtroom. "Yes," she whispered, "I saw what happened." Marcus leaned forward in his chair, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. His attorney looked surprised, but continued. "And what did you observe?" My mother took a shaky breath. "I saw my husband grab Brooklyn and shove her, twice. The second time, she hit the kitchen counter so hard I heard the impact from across the room." The courtroom was dead silent. Marcus's face had gone white, and his attorney was frantically shuffling through papers, clearly caught off guard. "Mrs. Kellerman," the lawyer said, "didn't you previously state that your daughter fell down the stairs?" I lied. My mother's voice was stronger now, more certain. I was scared. "Marcus told me to say she fell, and I was too afraid to contradict him." Judge Hernandez leaned forward. "Mrs. Kellerman, are you now recanting your previous statements?" "Yes, Your Honor, I'm telling the truth now. Marcus he's been hurting Brooklyn for months. I've seen the bruises, the fear in her eyes. I should have protected her, and I didn't. I was too scared of being alone again, too worried about losing the life we'd built together. But when I saw those x-rays, I realized how badly he'd hurt her." She broke down completely, sobbing into her hands. "I can't pretend anymore. I can't let him hurt my daughter and call it love." Marcus stood up abruptly, his face flushed with rage. "She's lying! Sarah, what are you doing? You know this is insane." "Mr. Kellerman, sit down," Judge Hernandez ordered sharply. "You're out of order." But Marcus was beyond caring about court protocol. "This is revenge because I asked for a separation last week. She's poisoning Brooklyn against me, turning my own family." "Bailiff," the judge said, and two officers moved toward Marcus. He sat down reluctantly, but the mask had completely slipped. For a moment, everyone in that courtroom saw the real Marcus Kellerman, angry, controlling, and dangerous. The prosecutor, who had been mostly silent until this point, stood up. Your Honor, in light of Mrs. Kellerman's testimony, the state would like to request that criminal charges be filed against Mr. Kellerman for felony child abuse. Everything happened very quickly after that. Judge Hernandez granted an immediate protective order, barring Marcus from any contact with me and ordering him to vacate the family home within 48 hours. The criminal charges would be filed separately, but the family court's primary concern was ensuring my safety. Mr. Kellerman, the judge said, you are to have no contact, direct or indirect, with the minor child. You may not go to her school, her place of residence, or anywhere she is known to frequent. Violation of this order will result in immediate arrest. Marcus's attorney was whispering urgently in his ear, but Marcus seemed to have shut down completely. He stared straight ahead, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. As we filed out of the courtroom, my mother approached me hesitantly. She looked terrible, guilt and shame written across every line of her face. Brooklyn, she started, I know I can never make up for what I let happen to you. I know saying sorry isn't enough. You're right, I said quietly. It's not enough, but it's a start. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I want to get help, therapy, counseling, whatever it takes. I want to understand how I let this happen, how I chose him over protecting you. Linda stepped forward. Sarah, you can start by getting that man out of your house and keeping him away from Brooklyn. Everything else comes after that. My mother agreed to file for divorce immediately and to attend counseling to address what the therapist would later identify as codependency and trauma bonding. She also agreed that I should remain with Linda until we were certain Marcus was truly out of our lives. As we walked out of the courthouse, I felt a strange mixture of relief and emptiness. The immediate danger was over, but the emotional aftermath was just beginning. I had exposed the truth and potentially sent my stepfather to prison, but I had also destroyed the only stable home I'd ever known. Are you okay? Linda asked as we reached her car. I thought about the question seriously. Was I okay? My ribs still ached when I moved wrong. My mother was devastated and guilt-ridden. My family was in pieces, and I'd have to testify in a criminal trial. Marcus was out there somewhere, probably furious and humiliated. But for the first time in months, I wasn't afraid. I wasn't walking on eggshells or watching someone's face for signs of impending violence. I could breathe without wondering what I'd done wrong or what punishment was coming. I think I will be, I said finally, eventually. The criminal trial was still months away, and there would be more testimony, more reliving of the worst moments of my life. But the hardest part was over. I had found my voice, and people had finally listened. That evening, safe in Linda's house, I called Ashley to tell her about the hearing. As I described my mother's testimony and Marcus's meltdown in court, I realized something important. I wasn't the same scared, isolated girl who had been pushed into that kitchen counter. Speaking my truth, having it believed and acted upon, had changed something fundamental inside me. The scared girl was gone. In her place was someone stronger, someone who would never again let anyone make her feel small or powerless or deserving of violence. The healing would take time, but it had finally begun. 2 weeks after the protective order was issued, Marcus violated it. I was walking out of Columbus East High School when I spotted his black pickup truck parked across the street. He was sitting in the driver's seat, sunglasses on, watching the school entrance. Our eyes met through the windshield, and he didn't look away. My blood turned to ice. I fumbled for my phone and called Linda immediately. He's here, I whispered, ducking behind a group of students. Marcus is at my school. Stay exactly where you are, Linda said, her voice sharp with alarm. I'm calling the police right now, and I'll be there in 10 minutes. Don't leave the school building. The police arrived before Linda did, 2 squad cars with lights flashing. By then, Marcus had driven away, but security cameras had captured his license plate. Officer Rebecca Torres, who had become familiar with our case, explained that this violation of the protective order meant automatic arrest. We'll pick him up at his workplace, she assured me. This kind of behavior typically escalates if we don't intervene immediately. Marcus was arrested that afternoon at his construction site. His employees watched as he was handcuffed and loaded into a police car, his carefully maintained reputation finally cracking in front of the people who had respected him. The local newspaper ran a small article about the arrest, identifying him as a contractor charged with violating a protective order in a domestic violence case. My mother called that evening, sobbing. "He posted bail," she said. "His lawyer got him out in 6 hours. Brooklyn, he came home furious. He packed all his things and left, but not before he destroyed the kitchen." She described finding the granite countertop cracked with a sledgehammer, cabinet doors ripped off their hinges, and holes punched in the drywall. He had methodically demolished the scene of my assault, as if destroying the physical evidence could somehow undo what had happened. "There was a note," my mother continued, her voice barely audible. It said, "This is what happens when you betray your family. I think it was meant for both of us." That night, Linda installed a security system and gave me a panic button to carry at all times. The reality was sinking in that Marcus's arrest had probably made him more dangerous, not less. Cornered and humiliated, he had nothing left to lose. The criminal trial was set for early June, just weeks after my graduation. The prosecutor, District Attorney Rebecca Walsh, was a tough woman in her 40s who specialized in domestic violence cases. She met with me several times to prepare my testimony, explaining what to expect from Marcus's defense team. "They're going to try to paint you as a troubled teenager who fabricated this story for attention," DA Walsh warned during one of our preparation sessions. "They'll bring up every detention you've ever had, every argument with your teachers, anything to make you seem unreliable." She wasn't wrong. Marcus's new attorney, a criminal defense specialist named Thomas Crawford, had already subpoenaed my school records going back to middle school. They were building a case that I was a habitual liar with behavior problems who had manipulated the situation to get revenge on my stepfather. "The good news," DA Walsh continued, "is that the medical evidence is irrefutable, and your mother's testimony will be powerful. She has nothing to gain from lying now. She's already filed for divorce and asked for nothing in the settlement." My mother's transformation over the past months has been remarkable. She had started individual therapy twice a week and had joined a support group for women who had experienced domestic violence. The guilt she carried was enormous, but she was finally facing the reality of what she had allowed to happen. "I'm learning about something called trauma bonding," she explained during one of our supervised visits. "It's when you become psychologically attached to your abuser because of the cycle of abuse and reconciliation. I thought Marcus's jealousy and control meant he loved me. I thought if I could just be perfect enough, he'd stop hurting you." These conversations were difficult but necessary. I was angry at her for not protecting me, but I was also beginning to understand how Marcus had manipulated both of us. He had isolated us from friends and family, made us financially dependent on him, and created an environment where questioning his authority felt impossible. Graduation day arrived in the middle of this emotional chaos. Linda had insisted on making it a celebration despite everything else going on. She decorated her house with balloons and bought me a beautiful silver necklace with a small key pendant. "For opening the door to your future," she said, fastening it around my neck. My mother came to the ceremony looking proud but fragile in a yellow dress that was too big for her diminished frame. Several of my old friends from Millbrook drove up to Columbus to watch me walk across the stage. Ashley brought a huge bouquet of sunflowers and burst into tears when they called my name. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered when we hugged afterward, "for everything, for surviving, for speaking up, for making it through." The trial began 3 weeks later. The Franklin County Courthouse was packed with spectators, some supportive, others clearly there out of curiosity about the local scandal. Marcus wore a conservative gray suit and had shaved off his beard, probably on his lawyer's advice to look less intimidating. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. DA Walsh presented the medical evidence first, bringing Dr. Martinez back to testify about my injuries. Then came the witnesses who had observed Marcus's behavior over the years, neighbors, school personnel, even some of his own employees who had witnessed his explosive temper. One of the most powerful testimonies came from Mrs. Henderson, our elderly next-door neighbor, who had kept a detailed journal of the shouting matches she had heard from our house. "It got progressively worse over the past year," she testified, reading from her careful notes. "The yelling became more frequent, and I started hearing what sounded like furniture being moved violently, doors slamming, sometimes crying. On March 15th, the night Brooklyn was hurt, I heard shouting that was so loud, I called my daughter to ask if I should call the police." "What stopped you?" DA Walsh asked. "The next morning, I saw Marcus in his driveway, calm as could be, loading his work truck. He waved and smiled like nothing had happened. I thought maybe I had imagined how bad it was." My mother's testimony was emotional and detailed. She walked the jury through the gradual escalation of Marcus's control and violence, her own fear and denial, and finally the night I was injured. When she described seeing me hit the counter, several jurors visibly winced. "Why didn't you seek medical attention for Brooklyn immediately?" DA Walsh asked. "Because I was terrified," my mother answered honestly. "Marcus told me that if anyone found out what happened, it would destroy our family. He said no one would believe us anyway because Brooklyn had been acting out lately. He convinced me that getting medical attention would only make things worse." The defense's case relied heavily on character assassination. Crawford brought in Marcus's business partners, who testified about his professionalism and community involvement. They called his ex-wife from his first marriage, who claimed he had never been violent with her or their children. But their star witness was Marcus himself. He spent 2 days on the stand, presenting himself as a devoted stepfather who had tried his best to provide stability for a troubled teenager. He denied ever deliberately hurting me, claiming that the incident in the kitchen was an accident that occurred when he was trying to prevent me from leaving the house after breaking curfew. "I grabbed her arm to stop her from walking away while I was talking to her," he testified. "She pulled away suddenly and lost her balance. When she fell against the counter, I was horrified. I immediately wanted to get her medical attention, but Brooklyn begged me not to because she was afraid of getting in trouble for lying about where she'd been." It was a believable story, told by a man who had years of practice manipulating people's perceptions. But DA Walsh's cross-examination revealed the holes in his narrative. "Mr. Kellerman, if this was truly an accident and you were concerned about Brooklyn's welfare, why didn't you call 911 immediately?" "She seemed okay at first. Kids bounce back quickly from minor injuries." 3 broken ribs constitute minor injuries? I didn't know they were broken at the time. But you did know she was in significant pain, correct? Your wife testified that Brooklyn could barely walk to her room that night. Marcus's composure began to crack under DA Walsh's relentless questioning. When she asked about his violation of the protective order, his carefully constructed facade slipped completely. "I had every right to check on my stepdaughter's welfare," he snapped. "She's been poisoned against me by her mother's lies and her aunt's interference. Someone needed to make sure she was okay." "By stalking her at school?" "I wasn't stalking anyone. I was concerned about a child I raised for 3 years. A child you're legally prohibited from contacting because you broke her ribs. That was an accident." His outburst echoed through the silent courtroom, and I could see several jurors recoil from his sudden display of anger. In that moment, they were seeing the real Marcus Kellerman, the man who couldn't tolerate being questioned or contradicted. When it was time for my testimony, I was terrified but ready. I had practiced with BA Walsh dozens of times, and Linda and my mother were both in the courtroom for support. I walked to the witness stand wearing a simple blue dress and the key necklace Linda had given me for graduation. I told my story clearly and completely, describing the pattern of escalating abuse, the night Marcus broke my ribs, and the months of fear that had preceded that violent confrontation. Crawford tried to rattle me during cross-examination, suggesting I was lying for attention or revenge, but I stayed calm and consistent. "Miss Hayes," he said during his final questions, "isn't it true that you resented your stepfather's authority and discipline?" "I resented being hurt and controlled," I replied. "There's a difference between discipline and abuse." "And isn't it true that you fabricated this entire story because you wanted your mother to choose between you and Mr. Kellerman?" I looked directly at Marcus for the first time during the trial. He was staring at me with that same cold expression I remembered from the kitchen that night. "Mr. Kellerman broke my ribs," I said clearly. "The X-rays prove that. The only thing I fabricated was the lie about falling downstairs, and I only did that because I was afraid of what he'd do if I told the truth." The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood and delivered the verdict: guilty on all charges: felony child abuse, violating a protective order, and intimidation of a witness. Marcus's face went completely blank as the judge sentenced him to 4 years in prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. He would also be required to complete anger management and domestic violence counseling before his release. As the bailiff led him away in handcuffs, Marcus turned back to look at me one last time. But instead of anger or hatred, I saw something that surprised me: defeat. The man who had terrorized our household for months looked small and broken, finally stripped of the power he had wielded over our family. Outside the courthouse, my mother and I hugged for a long time. We both cried for the trauma we had endured, for the time we had lost, for the family that had been destroyed. But we also cried with relief that it was finally over. "I'm proud of you," she whispered, "for being braver than I was, for speaking up when I couldn't." As we walked to Linda's car, I realized that this wasn't really an ending. It was a beginning. The healing would take years, and there would always be scars from what Marcus had done to our family. But for the first time since my mother had married him, I felt free to build a life without fear. The scared girl who had hidden bruises and made excuses for her stepfather's violence was gone. In her place was someone stronger, someone who knew her own worth and would never again allow anyone to make her feel powerless. Justice had been served, but more importantly, I had found my voice and learned to use it. That was the real victory. 1 year after Marcus's conviction, I stood in the doorway of my new dorm room at Ohio State University, holding a single cardboard box that contained everything I owned. My roommate, Jessica Chen, was already there arranging her side of the room with military precision: color-coordinated bedding, a small refrigerator, and what looked like enough school supplies to stock a store. "You're traveling light," she observed with a friendly smile. "Fresh start," I said simply, setting my box on the bare mattress that would be mine for the next year. Starting college had felt impossible just 18 months earlier, when I was living in fear and hiding bruises. Now, thanks to a combination of academic scholarships, financial aid, and a small fund Linda had started for my education, I was majoring in social work with the goal of becoming a victim advocate. The transition hadn't been easy. Those first months after the trial, I had struggled with panic attacks, nightmares, and a hypervigilance that made it difficult to relax even in safe spaces. Therapy with Dr. Patricia Vogel has been essential in helping me process the trauma and learn healthy coping mechanisms. "Healing isn't linear," Dr. Vogel had explained during one of our sessions. "You'll have good days and bad days. The goal isn't to forget what happened, but to integrate the experience in a way that doesn't control your future choices." My mother had moved into a small apartment near Linda's house, finally ready to build an independent life. Her own therapy journey had been just as difficult as mine, involving months of unpacking the codependent patterns that had made her vulnerable to Marcus's manipulation. "I'm learning to recognize red flags," she told me during one of our weekly coffee dates. "In therapy, we talk about how I confused control with care, jealousy with love. I need to understand those patterns so I never put you or myself in danger again." She had started working as a receptionist at a women's shelter, using her experience to help other survivors navigate the legal and emotional challenges of leaving abusive relationships. It was difficult work, but she found it meaningful in a way her old courthouse job had never been. "Every time I help someone understand their rights or connect them with resources, I feel like I'm making up for the times I failed to protect you," she explained. The most unexpected part of my healing journey was reconnecting with my biological father, David.
3 months after the trial, he had reached out through Linda, having heard about what happened through mutual friends. The man who showed up at Linda's door was dramatically different from the unreliable, addiction-struggling person I remembered from childhood.
I've been sober for 2 years, he told me that first awkward afternoon. I know I have no right to ask for another chance, but when I heard what you went through, I realized I hadn't just abandoned you physically. I left you vulnerable to predators like Marcus because I wasn't there to protect you. David had spent those years in recovery working through his own trauma and addiction issues. He was remarried to a kind woman named Carol, living in Cincinnati, and working as a peer counselor at a substance abuse treatment center. He didn't ask for immediate forgiveness or try to insert himself back into my life as if the abandonment had never happened. Instead, he offered consistent, patient presence. Phone calls every Sunday, birthday cards that arrived on time, and genuine interest in my college plans and career goals. He was learning to be a father at 45, and I was learning to trust him at 18. I can't undo the damage I caused by leaving, he said during one of our conversations, but I can be here now, for whatever comes next. My relationship with Ashley had deepened through everything we'd been through. She had started college at Miami University, majoring in criminal justice, and we talked at least twice a week. She had been my anchor during the darkest months, the friend who never doubted my story or made me feel like a burden. You saved your own life by speaking up, she told me during one of her visits to Columbus, but you also probably saved other kids from going through what you did. Marcus would have kept escalating if you hadn't stopped him. She was right. Through the victim advocates who worked with our case, I learned that domestic violence typically escalates over time. Marcus's violence toward me would likely have become more severe and frequent. Other children in his orbit, future stepchildren, perhaps even his own biological children, would have been at risk. The ripple effects of my decision to tell the truth extended beyond my immediate family. Several women in Millbrook came forward after the trial to share their own experiences with Marcus's controlling and intimidating behavior. While these incidents hadn't risen to the level of criminal abuse, they painted a picture of a man with a pattern of using fear and manipulation to dominate the people around him. One woman, Teresa Martinez, had briefly dated Marcus before he met my mother. She contacted the prosecutor's office to report that Marcus had stalked her after she ended their relationship, following her to work and showing up uninvited at her home. I was scared to report it at the time because he was so well respected in the community, she told DA Walsh. But after seeing how brave Brooklyn was, I realized my silence might have enabled him to hurt others. College life gave me the space and distance I needed to continue healing while building new skills and relationships. My criminal justice and social work classes provided an academic framework for understanding the dynamics I had experienced. Learning about trauma-informed care, the psychology of abuse, and the systemic factors that enable domestic violence helped me make sense of my own experience. Professor Maria Santos, who taught my introductory social work class, became an important mentor. She was a survivor herself, having left an abusive marriage in her 20s to pursue education and eventually a career helping others. Your lived experience will make you a powerful advocate, she told me after I shared my story in a class discussion about resilience. But remember that your trauma is not your only identity. You're also intelligent, compassionate, and determined. Don't let what happened to you become the only lens through which you see yourself. 6 months into my freshman year, I received an unexpected letter. It was from Marcus, written from Lebanon Correctional Institution, where he was serving his sentence. The envelope had been opened and inspected by prison officials before being forwarded to me through the Victim Services Office. The letter was 2 pages long, written in Marcus's careful handwriting. He claimed to have found religion in prison and wanted to apologize for any pain he had caused our family. He wrote about taking anger management classes and participating in a therapeutic community program. But even in his attempt at an apology, I could see the same manipulation tactics he had always used. He minimized his actions, mistakes were made, blamed external factors, I was under tremendous stress, and subtly suggested that my response had been disproportionate. I never intended for things to go as far as they did. The letter concluded with a request that I considered visiting him, or at least writing back, so he could make amends and help with both of our healing journeys.
I read the letter 3 times, then put it in a folder with all the other documents from the case. I didn't respond, and I didn't visit. Marcus was still trying to control the narrative, still trying to make his rehabilitation my responsibility. But I no longer felt obligated to manage his emotions or participate in his attempts at redemption. You don't owe him anything, Dr. Vogel reminded me when I brought the letter to our session. Not forgiveness, not visitation, not emotional labor to help him feel better about what he did. Your only obligation is to yourself and your own healing. Spring semester brought new challenges and opportunities. I started volunteering at a local domestic violence shelter, helping with intake interviews and support groups. The work was emotionally demanding, but deeply fulfilling. I was using my experience to help other survivors navigate the complex feelings of fear, guilt, and confusion that I knew so well. One evening, while facilitating a support group for teenage survivors, a 15-year-old named Destiny shared her story about being abused by her mother's boyfriend. The details were different, but the patterns were heartbreakingly familiar: the escalating control, the isolation from friends, the fear of speaking up. "How did you know it would get better?" she asked me after the group session. "How did you know people would believe you?" "I didn't know," I told her honestly. "I was terrified that no one would listen, or that speaking up would make things worse. But I realized that staying silent was definitely going to make things worse. At least by telling the truth, there was a chance things could change." Destiny nodded, tears in her eyes. "I want to tell someone, but I'm scared." "That's normal," I said. "Being scared doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. It just means you understand how important it is." A month later, Destiny disclosed her abuse to a school counselor. Her mother's boyfriend was arrested, and Destiny was placed in protective custody with her grandmother. It wasn't a perfect outcome, family preservation rarely is in these cases, but she was safe, and that was what mattered most. Watching Destiny find her voice reminded me how far I had come. 2 years earlier, I had been the scared teenager hiding bruises and making excuses for my abuser. Now, I was helping other survivors find the courage to speak their truth. As my freshman year ended, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. The scared, isolated girl who had been pushed into a kitchen counter was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own strength and worth. The trauma would always be part of my story, but it was no longer the whole story. Marcus would be eligible for parole in 18 months, but that no longer filled me with the panic it once would have. I had built a life independent of his influence, surrounded by people who valued and protected me. If he chose to violate parole and contact me, there were systems in place to respond. More importantly, I now had the confidence and resources to protect myself. My mother and I had dinner together the night before I moved back to Linda's for the summer. She looked healthier than she had in years. Her face had filled out again, and there was a lightness in her eyes that I hadn't seen since before Marcus entered our lives. "I'm proud of the woman you're becoming," she said as we shared dessert at our favorite restaurant. "You took something terrible and turned it into purpose. You're going to help so many people." "We both are," I replied. "Every survivor you help at the shelter, every woman you encourage to leave an abusive situation, that matters too." That summer, I interned with the prosecutor's office that had handled Marcus's case, working with DA Walsh on victim advocacy initiatives. I helped develop educational materials about recognizing abuse and learned about legislative efforts to strengthen protective order enforcement. One afternoon, while reviewing case files, I came across an update on Marcus's incarceration. He had been involved in a fight with another inmate and had lost privileges for several months. His participation in the anger management program had been suspended due to failure to take responsibility for his actions. Reading that report, I felt a mixture of sadness and vindication. Sadness that Marcus was still unable to genuinely change, still using violence when he felt challenged or disrespected, but also vindication that my instincts about his character had been correct. The charming, remorseful man who had written me that letter was just another performance. As I prepared to return to Ohio State for my sophomore year, I carried with me a deep sense of purpose and peace. The journey from victim to survivor to advocate had been painful and difficult, but it had also been profoundly meaningful. I was no longer defined by what Marcus had done to me. Instead, I was defined by what I had chosen to do with the experience, how I had found my voice, demanded justice, and was now using my story to help others find their own strength. The scared girl hiding bruises was gone. In her place stood a young woman who understood that speaking truth, even when it's terrifying, has the power to change everything. And that was a lesson I would carry with me for the rest of my life. 3 years had passed since Marcus's conviction when I received the call that changed everything again. I was in my senior year at Ohio State, working on my capstone project about trauma-informed interventions for adolescent abuse survivors, when my phone rang at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. "Brooklyn, it's Janet Morrison from CPS. I'm sorry to call so late, but there's been a development in the Kellerman case that you need to know about immediately." My blood ran cold. Janet only called for emergencies, and hearing Marcus's name after months of relative peace sent my anxiety spiking. "What happened?" I managed to ask, setting down my textbook on my dorm room desk. "Marcus was granted early parole this afternoon. He's being released next week, 18 months ahead of schedule. The parole board cited his participation in rehabilitation programs and good behavior. But Brooklyn, there's more. He's filed a motion to have the protective order modified. He wants permission to attend your college graduation."
The room started spinning. I gripped the edge of my desk, trying to process what Janet was telling me. Marcus getting out early was bad enough, but the idea of him showing up at my graduation, one of the most important days of my life, felt like a violation before it even happened. Can he do that? Can he really get the order changed? He can try. His lawyer is arguing that he's completed anger management, maintained employment while incarcerated, and poses no current threat. They're claiming that preventing him from attending your graduation constitutes cruel and unusual punishment and violates his rights as your former stepfather. I thought about the letter he'd written me in prison, the one where he'd minimized his abuse and tried to reframe himself as the victim. This felt like an extension of that same manipulation, using legal channels to force his way back into my life under the guise of caring about my achievements. When is the hearing? Friday morning. You have the right to appear and give a victim impact statement opposing the modification. DA Walsh is prepared to argue against it, but the judge will want to hear from you directly. After hanging up, I sat in my dark dorm room for a long time, staring at the wall covered with photos from college. Pictures of me with friends, at internships, receiving academic awards, volunteering at the shelter. I had built an entire life free from Marcus's influence, and now he was trying to insert himself back into it. I called Linda first. Even at midnight, she answered on the second ring, her voice immediately alert with concern. "He wants to come to my graduation," I said without preamble. "He's trying to get the protective order modified." Linda was quiet for a moment. Then her voice came back fierce and determined. "Over my dead body. That man has no right to be part of your achievements. He tried to destroy you, Brooklyn. He doesn't get to show up and take credit for who you've become." Next, I called my mother. She had remarried the previous year to a gentleman named Robert, a counselor at the Veterans Hospital who understood trauma and the long road to healing. When she answered, I could hear worry creep into her voice as I explained the situation. "I'll be at the hearing," she said immediately. "I'll testify about why that protective order needs to stay in place. Marcus gave up any right to celebrate your accomplishments when he chose violence over love." My father, I had started calling David that again over the past year, was equally outraged when I reached him. "I'll drive up from Cincinnati. This is exactly the kind of manipulation I recognize from my own addiction days.
He's using the legal system to continue his pattern of control. The support from my family helped, but I still felt the familiar anxiety that Marcus's presence in my life always triggered. Dr. Vogel, who I still saw monthly for maintenance therapy, helped me prepare for the hearing and process my feelings about Marcus's release. This is a perfect example of how abusers continue to exert control even from prison, she explained during our emergency session that week. By forcing you to appear in court to defend your right to safety, he's still managing to disrupt your life and make you think about him. That's intentional. Friday morning arrived gray and rainy, matching my mood as Linda and I walked into the familiar Franklin County Courthouse. DA Walsh met us in the hallway, her expression grim as she reviewed her notes. Marcus's lawyer is going to argue that he's been rehabilitated and that attending your graduation is part of making amends for his past actions. They'll probably present letters of support from other inmates and his prison counselor. But Rebecca, his parole records show some concerning patterns. She opened a folder and showed me several incident reports. While Marcus had avoided major disciplinary actions that would have affected his parole eligibility, there had been multiple complaints from other inmates about intimidating behavior, verbal threats, and attempts to manipulate weaker prisoners. He's learned to stay just below the radar, DA Walsh continued, but the pattern of controlling behavior is still there. He just got better at hiding it. When Marcus entered the courtroom, I barely recognized him. Prison had changed his appearance dramatically. He was leaner, his hair had gone completely gray, and he carried himself differently. But when his eyes found mine across the room, I saw the same cold calculation I remembered from that night in the kitchen. His attorney, a different lawyer than he'd had during the original trial, presented Marcus as a reformed man who had used his time in prison for genuine rehabilitation. They brought in his prison counselor, who testified about Marcus's participation in anger management programs and his work as a mentor for younger inmates. Mr. Kellerman has shown genuine remorse for his past actions, the counselor testified. He speaks often about wanting to make amends to his family, particularly his stepdaughter, for the pain he caused. Attending her graduation would be an important step in his healing process.
I wanted to scream at the manipulation in that statement. My graduation wasn't about Marcus's healing. It was about my achievement, despite what he had done to me. But I forced myself to stay calm and wait for my turn to speak. Marcus testified on his own behalf, presenting himself as a man who had learned from his mistakes and wanted nothing more than to celebrate my academic success from a distance. He claimed that seeing me graduate would give him closure and help him move forward with his life as a productive member of society. I know I made terrible mistakes, he said, his voice carefully modulated to sound humble and regretful. I hurt Brooklyn, and I hurt her mother. I've spent every day of the past 3 years working to understand why I acted the way I did and learning better ways to handle conflict and stress. He looked directly at me as he continued. I'm not asking for forgiveness or a relationship. I just want the chance to witness Brooklyn's success and know that despite my failures as a stepfather, she's become an incredible young woman. I believe I have something to contribute to her celebration, even if it's just my presence acknowledging her achievements. The manipulation in his words was subtle but clear to anyone who understood his patterns. He was reframing his desire to attend my graduation as being about me rather than about his need to control and insert himself into important moments of my life. When it was my turn to testify, I stood at the podium with a prepared statement, but also with 4 years of healing and growth behind me. I was no longer the scared teenager who had first told her story in this same courthouse. Your Honor, I want to be clear about something. My graduation is not about Marcus Kellerman. It's about the work I've done to overcome the trauma he inflicted on me and my family. It's about the education I've pursued to help other survivors of domestic violence. It's about building a life free from the fear and control that defined my adolescence under his roof. I looked at Marcus as I continued. The man sitting over there broke 3 of my ribs when I was 17 years old. He systematically isolated me from friends, controlled my activities, and created an atmosphere of fear in our home. When I finally found the courage to tell the truth about what he was doing, he stalked me at my school in violation of a protective order. Turning back to the judge, I continued with growing confidence. Mr. Kellerman claims he wants to celebrate my achievements, but my greatest achievement has been learning to live without him. The protective order isn't just a legal document, it's a boundary that allows me to feel safe in my own life. Modifying it now would send the message that his desire to feel good about himself is more important than my right to safety and peace. DA Walsh presented evidence about Marcus's behavior in prison, the concerning patterns that suggested his apparent rehabilitation was superficial. She also read statements from Dr. Martinez and several of my college professors about the ongoing impact of domestic violence and the importance of maintaining boundaries with abusers. This isn't about punishment, DA Walsh argued. It's about protection. Mr. Kellerman has served his time, and he'll have opportunities to build a new life. But that new life cannot include inserting himself into his victim's milestone moments. Brooklyn Hayes has earned the right to celebrate her graduation without the presence of the man who tried to destroy her future. My mother testified about the ongoing impact of Marcus's abuse on our family and her concerns about any modification to the protective order. She spoke about her own healing journey and how maintaining distance from Marcus had been essential for both of us to rebuild our lives. Marcus is skilled at presenting himself as reasonable and reformed, she said, but I lived with him for 3 years. I know how good he is at saying what people want to hear while harboring anger and resentment underneath. Brooklyn deserves to celebrate her accomplishments without wondering if the man who broke her ribs is watching from the audience. The hearing lasted 4 hours. During breaks, I could feel Marcus's eyes on me, studying my reactions and probably calculating how to adjust his approach. It was the same predatory attention I remembered from my teenage years, disguised now as rehabilitation and remorse. Judge Hernandez, the same judge who had presided over Marcus's original sentencing, took 30 minutes to review all the testimony and evidence before delivering her ruling. While the court acknowledges that Mr. Kellerman has completed required programs during his incarceration, the protection of domestic violence survivors must take precedence over the desires of their abusers to participate in their victims' life events. The protective order will remain in full effect. Mr. Kellerman is prohibited from attending Ms. Hayes' graduation or any other events where she is present. The relief was overwhelming. I felt Linda squeeze my hand and saw tears in my mother's eyes. Marcus's face remained impassive, but I caught the flash of anger in his eyes before he controlled his expression. As we filed out of the courtroom, Marcus's lawyer approached DA Walsh about filing an appeal. I overheard enough of their conversation to understand that Marcus wasn't giving up. He was going to continue using the legal system to harass me for as long as possible. That evening, my family gathered at Linda's house for dinner. The mood was celebratory, but also somber as we discussed the reality of Marcus being released and the likelihood that this wouldn't be his last attempt to violate the protective order. "We need to be prepared for escalation," my father said. "Men like Marcus don't give up easily when they're challenged. Winning today might make him more determined to find other ways to get to Brooklyn." He was right. Over the next few weeks, Marcus tested the boundaries of the protective order in small but concerning ways. He drove past Linda's house several times, technically not violating the order since he didn't stop or make contact, but clearly sending a message that he knew where I was. He created social media accounts under fake names and attempted to connect with my friends and classmates. Most troubling, he got a job at a construction company that was contracted to do renovation work on the Ohio State campus. While he wasn't assigned to any buildings where I had classes, his presence on campus felt like a deliberate attempt to intimidate me. "He's probing for weaknesses," explained Detective Torres, who had been promoted since working on my original case. "This is classic stalking behavior, testing boundaries, gathering information, maintaining psychological pressure while staying just within legal limits." The university's threat assessment team worked with campus police to ensure my safety during my final semester. I was assigned a parking spot in a secure garage, given a campus safety escort service for walking between buildings after dark, and provided with direct contact information for campus security. Despite these precautions, the constant awareness of Marcus's presence affected my final semester. I found myself hypervigilant again, checking over my shoulder, varying my routines, and feeling the familiar anxiety that I thought I'd left behind. It was frustrating to realize how quickly the old patterns of fear could resurface. Dr. Vogel helped me understand that this regression was normal and temporary. Trauma responses are adaptive, she explained. Your body is responding to a real threat. The difference is that now you have tools, support systems, and legal protections that you didn't have as a teenager. My senior capstone project became more personal as I researched the long-term impacts of protective order violations on domestic violence survivors. I interviewed dozens of women who had experienced ongoing harassment from their abusers through legal manipulation, social media stalking, and other forms of psychological warfare. The abuse doesn't end with a court order or even a prison sentence, one survivor told me during my research. They find new ways to maintain control and remind you that they're still out there. Fear becomes a different kind of prison. Her words resonated deeply with my own experience. Marcus might be physically free, but I was still carrying the psychological constraints of knowing he was watching, waiting, and planning his next move. As graduation approached, my anxiety about the day itself intensified. Even though the protective order was still in place, I couldn't shake the fear that Marcus would find a way to be there. The university had arranged additional security, and my entire family would be present, but the thought of looking out into the audience and potentially seeing his face made my stomach clench. The night before graduation, Linda found me sitting on her back porch, staring at the invitation list for my graduation party. I had been second-guessing every name, wondering if Marcus might somehow use one of my guests to gain information about the celebration. "You're letting him steal this moment from you," she said gently, sitting down beside me. "Brooklyn, you've earned this degree, despite everything he did to try to break you. Don't let the possibility of his presence diminish what you've accomplished." She was right, but breaking the cycle of hypervigilance and fear was easier said than done. Marcus's release had triggered all the survival mechanisms I'd developed during the worst period of the abuse, and learning to feel safe again would take time. "I keep thinking about how he used to ruin every important moment," I admitted. "Birthday dinners cut short because I said something wrong, school events where I spent the whole time worried about his mood afterward. What if graduation day feels the same way?" "It won't," Linda said firmly, "because you're not the same person you were then. You're stronger, you have people who love and protect you, and you have legal safeguards in place. Most importantly, you've learned to advocate for yourself." Graduation day dawned bright and clear, a perfect May morning that felt like a gift from the universe. As I put on my cap and gown, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment, from the scared teenager hiding bruises to the confident young woman who was about to receive her degree in social work. My phone buzzed with a text from Ashley, who had driven up from Cincinnati, where she now works as a victim advocate for the prosecutor's office. "Today is your day. You did this. You survived, you thrived, and you're about to change the world for other survivors. Marcus Kellerman has no power over this moment." As I walked across the stage to receive my diploma, I scanned the audience and saw my family cheering in the designated section. Linda with tears streaming down her face, my parents holding hands and beaming with pride, my mother looking healthier and happier than I'd seen her in years. Marcus was nowhere to be seen. The protective order had held, the security measures had worked, and most importantly, I had reclaimed my right to celebrate my achievements without fear. After the ceremony, at the graduation party Linda had organized, I gave a short speech to the friends and family who had supported me through the darkest period of my life and the brightest moments of my recovery. 4 years ago, I didn't think I would live to see my 18th birthday, let alone graduate from college, I began. The person who tried to destroy my future isn't here today, and that's exactly how it should be. This celebration belongs to all of us who chose love over fear, truth over silence, and healing over hatred. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, I stepped outside to get some air and found myself looking up at the stars. For the first time in weeks, I felt truly peaceful. Marcus was out there somewhere, probably planning his next move, but I was no longer living in fear of what he might do. I had graduated summa cum laude with a degree that would allow me to help other survivors find their voices and rebuild their lives. I had a job lined up at a domestic violence advocacy center, a supportive family, and the hard-earned knowledge that I was stronger than anything anyone could do to me. The scared girl who had hidden bruises and made excuses for her abuser was gone forever. In her place stood a woman who understood that speaking truth, demanding justice, and refusing to be silenced could change everything, not just for herself, but for countless others who needed to know that survival was possible. As I looked up at those stars, I made a promise to myself, and to every survivor who would cross my path in the years to come. Marcus Kellerman had taken enough from me. He would not take another moment, another celebration, or another piece of my future. The next chapter of my story would be written entirely by me, and it would be a story of triumph, purpose, and unshakable strength. 2 years after graduation, I was working as a senior victim advocate at the Central Ohio Domestic Violence Coalition when the call came that would finally close the chapter on Marcus Kellerman forever. It was Detective Torres, now a lieutenant with the Franklin County Sheriff's Department, and her voice carried the weight of urgent news. Brooklyn, Marcus Kellerman was arrested this morning on charges of aggravated domestic violence and stalking. The victim is his new girlfriend, Denise Patterson. She's in the hospital with a broken jaw, fractured orbital bone, and severe bruising. She specifically asked to speak with you. My hands began to shake as I processed this information. Part of me felt vindicated. Marcus hadn't changed, despite all his claims of rehabilitation. But mostly, I felt sick knowing that another woman had endured the violence I had escaped. How did she know to ask for me? She'd researched him online after noticing some concerning behavior, found news articles about your case from 5 years ago. When she saw your name mentioned as working in victim advocacy, she specifically requested you as her advocate. An hour later, I was sitting in Riverside Methodist Hospital, looking at a young woman who could have been me at 17. Denise Patterson was 23, with long brown hair and kind eyes that were now swollen shut from Marcus's assault. Her jaw was wired shut, making communication difficult, but her determination to tell her story was unmistakable. Through careful questioning and written notes, Denise's story emerged. She had met Marcus at a coffee shop 6 months earlier, charmed by his apparent gentleness and stability. He had presented himself as a reformed man who had made mistakes in his past but had learned from them. He said he'd been married before and that his stepdaughter had behavioral problems that put stress on the family, Denise wrote on the notepad I provided. He made it sound like you were troubled and that he was the victim of false accusations. The familiar pattern had played out exactly as I might have predicted. Marcus had moved in with Denise after just 2 months, gradually isolating her from friends and family. He monitored her phone, controlled her finances, and became increasingly violent when she questioned his authority. Last night, he found out I'd been saving money in a secret account, she wrote. I was planning to leave. When he confronted me, I told him I knew about you and that I wasn't going to let him do to me what he'd done to his stepdaughter. That's when Marcus had exploded. According to Denise's statement, he had flown into a rage about being betrayed by ungrateful women and how I had ruined his life with lies. The beating that followed was savage and sustained, ending only when neighbors called police after hearing screaming. He kept saying your name while he was hitting me, Denise wrote, tears streaming down her bruised face. He said he was going to find you after he dealt with me. He said you needed to pay for what you'd done to him. Working with Denise over the following weeks, I helped her navigate the legal system, connect with counseling services, and develop a safety plan for when Marcus inevitably made bail. But this time was different. Marcus's parole violation meant he would likely face substantial prison time, and the severity of Denise's injuries elevated the charges to felony level. DA Walsh, who had stayed in touch over the years, was personally prosecuting the case. This time, we have everything, she told me during a strategy meeting.
Denise's medical records, neighbor witnesses, a clear pattern of escalation, and his violation of parole terms. Plus, your case establishes his history of domestic violence.
The trial began 4 months later. I testified about Marcus's previous pattern of abuse, helping establish his history of domestic violence for the jury. But the real power came from Denise's testimony. Despite her injuries and trauma, Denise was a compelling witness. She spoke clearly about Marcus's manipulation tactics, his escalating control, and the night he nearly killed her. When the defense tried to suggest she was exaggerating her injuries, she quietly removed her sunglasses to show the jury the permanent damage to her left eye. "I will never see normally again because of what Marcus Kellerman did to me," she said, her voice steady despite her obvious pain. "But I'm testifying because I don't want there to be another victim after me." Marcus was convicted on all charges and sentenced to 15 years in prison without possibility of parole. At 52 years old, he would likely spend the rest of his productive life behind bars. More importantly, the conviction allowed us to petition for a lifetime protective order, a relatively new legal tool that would remain in effect even after Marcus's eventual release. Judge Hernandez, presiding over her final case before retirement, granted the order with clear language. "Mr. Kellerman has demonstrated a clear pattern of escalating violence against intimate partners and family members," she stated. "The court finds that he poses a continuing threat to Ms. Hayes and potentially to other women. This protective order shall remain in effect for the duration of his natural life." After the sentencing, Denise and I sat in the courthouse cafeteria, sharing coffee and processing what had just happened. "Do you think he'll try to contact us from prison?" she asked. "Probably," I said honestly. "But now we know what to expect, and more importantly, we know we're stronger than his attempts to manipulate us." Denise had decided to relocate to Seattle, where her sister lived, for a fresh start. She was considering returning to school to study law, inspired by her experience with the legal system. "I want to help other women like us," she said. "Marcus tried to destroy me, but instead, he created another advocate." That conversation crystallized something I had been thinking about for months. My work at the coalition was fulfilling, but I felt called to do something bigger, something that could prevent other women from enduring what Denise and I had experienced. 6 months later, I enrolled in law school at Ohio State, focusing on family law and domestic violence legislation. My plan was to work on strengthening protective order laws and improving the legal system's response to domestic violence cases. The transition from advocate to law student was challenging but energizing. I brought a perspective to class discussions that my classmates found eye-opening, and my professors encouraged me to write about legal reforms that could better protect survivors. During my second year, I was selected for a legislative internship with State Representative Maria Lopez, who chaired the Committee on Domestic Violence Prevention. Together, we worked on drafting Brooklyn's Law, legislation that would strengthen protective orders and create automatic lifetime orders for repeat domestic violence offenders. "Your story changed everything for me," Representative Lopez told me as we worked on the bill's language. "Before meeting you, I understood domestic violence intellectually, but hearing how the system both failed and eventually protected you showed me where the gaps are." Brooklyn's Law passed unanimously in both chambers of the Ohio legislature and was signed by the governor on the 5-year anniversary of my original assault. The signing ceremony was held at the State House, with survivors, advocates, and legislators gathered to mark the occasion. My mother, now happily married to Robert and working as a supervisor at the women's shelter, introduced me at the ceremony. "My daughter survived something that could have destroyed her," she said. "But instead of just surviving, she chose to thrive and to ensure that other women would have better protection under the law." Brooklyn turned her pain into purpose, and today, that purpose becomes the law of our state. As I spoke at the podium, I looked out at the audience and saw Denise, who had flown in from Seattle for the ceremony. She was starting her final year of law school and planned to specialize in domestic violence prosecution. 5 years ago, I was a scared teenager who thought no one would believe me if I told the truth about what was happening in my home, I began. Today, I'm a law student, an advocate, and the namesake of legislation that will protect countless women from the kind of violence I experienced. I paused, thinking about the journey that had brought me to this moment. Domestic violence thrives in silence and isolation. Abusers count on their victims being too afraid, too ashamed, or too hopeless to speak up. But when we find our voices, when we tell our truth despite the fear, we don't just save ourselves, we save others. After the ceremony, Linda and I walked through the State House rotunda, marveling at how far we'd come from that terrified girl she'd taken in after the hospital visit. "Your parents would be so proud," she said, referring to my grandparents who had passed away during my college years. "They always said you were destined for something special, even when you were little." That evening, my extended family gathered for dinner at the same restaurant where my mother and I had eaten after the first court hearing years earlier. The conversation was light and celebratory, filled with stories about law school, wedding plans for Ashley, who is marrying her college boyfriend, and Robert's upcoming retirement. As we were leaving, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. For a moment, my old anxiety spiked. Marcus was still in prison, but he had found ways to contact people before. But this message was different. "Miss Hayes, my name is Jennifer Walsh. I saw the news about Brooklyn's law. I'm 19 and trying to get away from my stepfather who has been hurting me. Can you help me find resources? Your story gives me hope that someone will believe me." I showed the message to Linda, who smiled and squeezed my shoulder. "And it continues," she said simply. Over the next hour, I connected Jennifer with local resources, helped her develop a safety plan, and arranged for her to meet with an advocate in her area. It was the kind of work I had been doing for years, but tonight it felt especially meaningful. Later, as I sat in my apartment reviewing case law for my family violence seminar, I reflected on the path that had led me here. The scared teenager who had hidden bruises and made excuses for her abuser felt like a character from someone else's story. In her place was a woman who had transformed trauma into advocacy, pain into purpose, and silence into a voice that was changing laws and saving lives. Marcus Kellerman was serving 15 years in a maximum security prison. His appeals had been denied, and his attempts to contact me through intermediaries had been unsuccessful. The lifetime protective order meant that even if he lived to be released as an elderly man, he would never again have legal grounds to intrude on my life. But more importantly, I had learned that true power doesn't come from controlling others. It comes from refusing to be controlled. Marcus had tried to break me, to silence me, to make me small and afraid. Instead, he had inadvertently created someone who understood exactly how the system could fail survivors and was now working to fix those failures. As I prepared for bed that night, I looked at the framed photo on my nightstand, a picture from Brooklyn's law signing ceremony, showing me surrounded by advocates, legislators, and other survivors. We were all smiling, all strong, all proof that violence doesn't get the last word. Tomorrow, I would wake up and continue the work, helping survivors, studying law, writing legislation, and speaking the truth about domestic violence. It was work I had never planned to do, born from trauma I never should have experienced, but it was also work that gave my life profound meaning and purpose. The journey from victim to survivor to advocate had been long and difficult, marked by setbacks and breakthroughs, tears and triumphs. But as I turned off the light and settled into sleep, I felt nothing but gratitude for the strength I had discovered within myself and the family I had chosen to surround myself with. Marcus Kellerman had broken my ribs 5 years earlier, thinking he was teaching me a lesson about power and control. Instead, he had taught me that I was unbreakable, not because I couldn't be hurt, but because I could heal, grow stronger, and use that strength to protect others. That was the real victory, and it was one that could never be taken away. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.